Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. Today we're going to begin, in a sense, an interesting recap of things that I've said on and off before, but enlarging on the subject so that those of you who may have seen previous broadcasts will understand a little better some of the things that came up along the way. I've decided to focus the whole video on things related to something we're all familiar with, I think, which is water. And actually, when you talk about water, you have to also talk about pH. And those have become two big issues today, and I keep hearing it over and over and over. So I'm going to call this particular video Understanding Water and pH. Now, it's really difficult to separate the two because I'm sure that at some point along the way you've heard the term alkaline water or alkalized water, and I'm sure many of you have been confronted with people selling various devices that are going to alkalize your water. And I have many patients coming in. It's become so universal that new patients coming in saying, well, I drink alkaline water all the time. Incidentally, they're not healed, which is, to me, some bit of testimony regarding the effectiveness. Now, I guess I'm not saying that it would never, under any circumstance, be helpful to maybe, on a very, very short basis, to maybe drink some alkaline water. In fact, some of the researchers in understanding the body and pH, etc., have talked about something called an alkaline shock, which means for about 2 or 3 days taking a large amount of alkalizers and then stopping, allowing the body to respond to that. And so they refer to it as an alkaline shock. However, that's not what's happening. I'm having people that on a consistent basis are drinking water at pH of 9 to 10 and loading themselves with alkalinity. Now, it's true that if you push the body considerably out of balance and overwhelm it with something, you can sometimes, let's say, push symptoms aside. And if you want evidence of that, all you have to do is look at all the drugs that are on the market by the pharmaceuticals, because that's exactly what they do. They override processes in the body, and hence they manage symptoms. And as we've said time and again, managing symptoms can make you feel better temporarily sometimes. However, you pay a price, because the ultimate end of that is that you ruin your health. So I'm not saying in an emergency and somebody is badly injured or broken up in a bad accident that maybe painkillers temporarily for intense pain, or maybe some other medications might be helpful for just a very short period of time. But in general, the ingestion of anything that's going to suppress or turn off symptoms ultimately lead to deeper serious problems. So at any rate, I just, everywhere I turn, I keep hearing people talk about, you've got to alkalize, we're too acid, you've got to alkalize. And the question is that accurate? And my feeling is no. Too much of anything, even good, is not good. It can create a problem. And I think we've mentioned that before about eating a particular food. If you eat huge amounts of it over a period of time, it actually will generate problems in your system. In homeopathic medicine 200 years ago, that was referred to as proving. In other words, you establish what the symptoms are of a substance or a food or whatever, because it's called the reversal effect. And I mentioned earlier, there is a huge book out that has the most citations for research of any single book that's been published, or at least as far as I know, and that was the title given to them as the most citations with the world record, the Guinness Book of Records. And the reason is he was trying to establish a point called the reversal effect, that too much of something has a reverse effect. And so, in my mind, it's never good to overdo anything, including natural substances, whether for diet or whether for a treatment of some sort, that there comes a point when it can go the opposite way. So, I mean, this happens in regular medicine all the time. Somebody has elevated blood pressure, they give them a drug, and it reduces it some, so they increase the dose to get more of a reduction, and then suddenly they hit a point where the blood pressure goes crazy, going high, because now it reversed. And so the same would be true with drinking nothing but huge amounts of alkaline water. Now, I have studied this subject for pushing 30 years. I would say significantly since the early 1980s. When I went on my German study trips, there was a period of years that every year I went to Germany for several days and studied with some of the top researchers and clinicians. Germany, Austria, England, and some of the speakers came over from Switzerland, and so it was interesting to find out what they were doing and the approach they were taking. And so, as a consequence, I ran into some doctors who were involved in heavy research in terms of body pH and health. And what I'm going to do with this discussion is get into the implications of water and pH in their connection and some of the things that they do in the body. So to get started with that, we're going to talk about some of the researchers that I have personally read their material, and of course there's a lot more. This is only some of the key ones, but I'd say one of the top ones is a physicist by the name of Wolfgang Ludwig. He has done a tremendous amount of research. I personally studied with him and got to know him, and he, based on his research, ended up getting into developing ways of utilizing his knowledge in the field of health and natural medicine. And of course he realized the folly of drugs and the fact that they weren't really solving problems, but in the long run creating problems. So we'll be talking some about Dr. Ludwig's work, in particular his idea of memory of water, or the imprinting of water, and whether you agree or disagree, you might want to look at some of his work. A second physicist that I had studied some with was F.A. Popp, P-O-P-P. He was also a PhD physicist, and he has done a lot of work with not only the water idea, but biophotons. And biophotons are messengers within the body that carry information from one area to another very rapidly, in fact, pretty much at the speed of light. And their effect on the body and how the body communicates throughout by utilizing biophotons. And his material, I think, is extremely good. He's published some books, so if you can find some of his books, you might enjoy reading them. And he developed some equipment that was so sensitive that it can pick up one single photon. You know, and if you remember from your reading or study that you may have run across the fact that a photon is like 1 unit of light, having a particle-like effect, or a wave packet, if you want to refer to it as a wave. And so 1 dot, I mean, when I say dot, a microdot of light, is detectable with some of the equipment that Dr. Pop developed. So he later developed some methods of using biophotons to enhance health for people who are weak or sickened, and to help in recovery. Because of the fact that when people get really sick, sometimes there is a reduction or blockage of the movement of the biophotons in the system, and hence problems. Now, I understand that some of the terminology might not be as familiar to you, but we want to educate you as much as possible to at least introduce you to some material that you'll probably have to wrestle with over time. And I'll, again, work on keeping it more on the lighter side, but some of the stuff, there's just no way you can understand it without having to wrestle with some ideas that you're unfamiliar with. And you'll find that after a while, that's been my experience, because sometimes I've read the material, and when it was done, I thought, what were they talking about? And I would reread it again, and then again, and then again, and then all of a sudden, zing! Oh, now I see what they're talking about. So we'll work on keeping it below that threshold as much as possible, that you when you think about it, then it will make sense. And the interesting thing about natural medicine and understanding the body as it works naturally, that when I tell new patients, because it ends up that education is a big part of what I have to do, because people come in thinking they're going to get a natural substance that will suppress their symptoms with less adverse effects than the drug they were taking. And of course, that's not what we do. I tell them the symptoms will leave when the problem is corrected without suppressing the symptoms, because the symptoms are a signal or sign from the body that it's attempting to make some correction. And once the correction is taken care of, then the symptoms disappear. And totally different concept than taking a drug that just turns off signals. And therefore you don't feel the symptom anymore, but there still is a problem. And that problem, as I've said many times, tends to go deeper over time and be more serious and manifest in a deeper, more serious way. Now, some of the other people that I studied with or their material was Professor Claude Vincent from France, who was a professor in the university, and his specialty is hydrology, which is the study of water. And he's done a tremendous amount of research, and he was hired by the French government to measure all the commercial water supplies of the world. And they ended up measuring bottled water and everything to find out what has happened to people's health since they went to public water supplies as opposed to people's own private water supplies. And what he found was that there was a tremendous increase in cardiovascular problems and cancer in every part of the world that went to a public water supply over individual water supplies. And so he joined forces with another doctor that I studied with extensively, including he came to the U.S. and taught a program at my office involving what we're going to talk about that is an important piece of information to have. There were people that came actually from not only over the U.S. but from out of the U.S. to Orlando to my office, and we went into heavy detail about a monitoring system that was developed originally by Professor Vincent, and later he and Dr. Morel got together and made application not just with water but with human beings, and they developed a system called BEV, or Bioelectronic Vincent, named after Professor Vincent. And BEV became a standard in Germany with doctors who were wanting to get people well. You know, I keep emphasizing that symptoms are not a measure, and suppression of the symptoms is not a measure of health or sickness. The symptoms are the body's own systems. In almost every case, the symptom is the body trying very hard or working at correcting a problem. Now, whether it's successful or not depends on a lot of factors: how toxic the materials it's dealing with, how strong the body is energetically, and how well it is capable of dealing with problems, or whether systems of the body that normally would take care of problems have been inhibited or blocked in some way by some toxic intrusion. Okay, so Dr. Morell became an expert, and I have to say that the BEV system, he did in excess of 1 million measurements. Now, you tell me how many research projects involve over 1 million measurements of subjects to verify the information that they have gleaned and the effectiveness of the system in pointing out problems and the correction of problems. And so we're going to talk more about that in a moment, but I wanted you to know that it was not just that, well, we tried this on 2 or 3 patients and it seemed to be helpful. We're talking about every patient that Dr. Morell had for years, from the first time they came to his office and throughout the process of treating them. They were measured on this system several times. Now, why am I emphasizing this system? Because in a moment, when we talk about this craze or fad of alkalinity and alkalizing, you'll see why it's important. Another main player in understanding some of what we're talking about is Dr. George Cryle, MD. Way back in the 20s, he wrote a book called The Bipolar Process of Living Tissue, and he talked about the electrical side, the electricity that goes on in the body. Now, whether we like to admit it or not, or even thought about it, the body has a battery set up and an electrical system, and the electrical system is what makes things happen. And having a way to monitor that electrical system or that battery is very important. Now, the battery side of it is what kind of energy do we have available in the body, and the other part of it is what is the body doing, or how is it utilizing that energy, or is it failing, or is it inhibited in some way in making use of it? And so we'll be talking more about that. Another one of the doctors that was very important was Dr. Reinhold Voll, VOLL, MD, and I bring him up because he developed a system called EAV, electroacupuncture according to Voll, and he revolutionized a method, and ultimately they developed a society of doctors to study the human body and the effectiveness of the system that he developed, but he utilized the BEV system as a objective way of measuring the effectiveness of the system that he was utilizing, or showing that could be useful in helping people regain their health. And instead of him just saying, well, they don't seem to feel their symptoms, hence they must be better, what he said was, that's subjective, and what we want is something that gives us important data apart from our own subjective ideas. In other words, this tells you pieces of information that in a certain set of relationships would indicate good health. And so utilizing this system, he was able to back up what he was researching and proving to be true. And so, well, again, we're going to be talking more about BEV in a minute. It's very important, and I think tremendously powerful. Another big researcher that's very important in understanding some of what we're talking about is a PhD who is a physicist and engineer by the name of Cyril W. Smith out of Great Britain, and he did a tremendous amount of studies with energy, water, and what's called the memory of water. And we'll talk again about that a little bit later, which is one of the reasons why it's so important to understand something about the nature of water. And it's much, much more complex than what you might think, the same as the subject of pH is much, much more complex than what you might think. But we'll talk more about that in a moment. Out of Italy, there is an MD and a group of MDs who have gotten together and formed a research organization. And it's interesting because natural medicine has grown tremendously in Italy. I've met several doctors who have gotten heavily involved in it and have gone to natural methodologies to find problems and natural methodologies in terms of correction of those problems. And of the books that I'm going to suggest, I will go ahead and mention the one put out by Dr. Citro called The Basic Code of the Universe. It's a very good book. It's recent and very good research material in it. And the subtitle is The Science of the Invisible in Physics, Medicine, and Spirituality. And the foreword to the book is written by another very, very valuable person to get into his books by the name of Irvin Laszlo. But anyhow, he gets into some of the things that we're talking about very heavily, and with a tremendous amount of research is able to back up and verify a lot of things that we've been talking about. Luc Montagnier, researcher from the Pasteur Institute in Paris, France, supposedly one of the most prestigious research institutes in the world and goes back a long way, many, many years. He's done a tremendous amount of research. And of course, if you know some about your current medical history, you will remember that Luc Montagnier is the individual that found a virus in the lymphatic system of some people with AIDS and sent a sample to the U.S., which ended up being picked up by Dr. Gallo. And Dr. Gallo guessed that it was the cause of AIDS, and so they both ultimately shared a Nobel Prize for their connection of HIV with AIDS, and of course, as I mentioned before, and we'll probably at some point do another broadcast on it. Back along the way, we've talked about the fact that there never was a study, as far as I know at this point, that connected or showed a causal effect of HIV and AIDS, but that's another story, so we won't get too much into it. But anyhow, Luc Montagnier, at some point along the way, in his research, now has come out and written a paper for which he's been criticized, that is actually verifying the memory of water, showing how it can hold information that can be helpful or detrimental to someone. And therefore saying, well, gee, maybe there really is scientific evidence, and he gives reasons why, because of some studies he's done on the fact that the water does hold information. And so he published a research paper, and in recent years he has actually filed for a couple U.S. patents related to some of this information. Anyhow, he's now received critique from the scientific community instead of the praise he had for years of his supposed discoveries related to AIDS. Unfortunately for France, he is now departed from France and is now in China, because the Chinese are really on the move in terms of research in the field of medicine. And they've invited some other researchers over and given them backing to look into things that the regular medical establishment here, of course, poo-pooed or had no interest in because it did not involve the use of drugs. Another big name, I think it's very important to look at his material, is a MD out of Austria by the name of Alfred Pischinger, and he's done all the studies on the body matrix system, which is really the core of the body, and everything that happens ultimately somehow involves going through the matrix, and it's also an area of the body that can end up being the storage ground of a tremendous amount of toxic material, and ultimately lead to the body not working very well. And he also was heavily into the acid-alkaline thing. One other name I'm going to throw in, this gentleman, this doctor out of New York, has in the last few years now expired. I think he was up in his early 90s. He was not liked by the regular medical establishment, even though he was a MD and a researcher. And he did a lot of juggling with pH, and he found that he could suppress things by shifting pH, by having the person eat a lot of a certain type of thing, especially in fatty acids, that could shift pH in certain directions and could alleviate pain and other symptoms. So he wrote a lot of material about it. I have his material. It's sometimes very difficult to read because about halfway through the whole thing he changed his terminology, and therefore when you're reading his material you have to watch that you're understanding what he's talking about. But very good name to look into at some of the things he was doing. But he had gotten heavily into the acid-alkaline idea. Book-wise, there are several books that are available. I mentioned The Basic Code of the Universe by Dr. Citro out of Italy. There is a good book just on one of the states of water called The Water Puzzle and the Hexagonal Key, Scientific Evidence of Hexagonal Water and Its Positive Influence on Health by Dr. Mu-Shik Chan. It's available still, as far as I know, through Amazon. Another one on water, The Foundations of Youth, Health, and Beauty. It's just a good book in general about some ideas on water. Another good one called An Introduction to the Biophysics of Activated Water. What happens when you activate water by exposing it to certain things like electromagnetic fields and so forth, and how it changes the nature of the water and what it does. Another very good book on the memory of water, and of course it basically involves homeopathy. That was part of the purpose of it, but the idea of the memory of water is important, and the author is Michael Schiff, S-C-H-I-F-F, and it's got a lot of good material about the studies that have done. Now, there's no way we have time to get into all the studies, but we're going to at least give you the ideas and some of the references, and it's up to you what you want to do with it. If it interests you, good. But I guess if you're interested in health, it's probably something very worthwhile looking into. There's one other one by Masaru Emoto, a Japanese researcher on water and a special process of rapid freezing or crystallization of water. And his one, I think it's his first book he put out, was called The Memory of Water. So, and there's several that has out now. One of his later ones is called Water Crystal Healing, Music and Images to Restore Your Well-Being. But it's interesting material to read, and you may notice on the front there's this snowflake, and snowflakes always form a hexagonal pattern when it freezes rapidly, either falling from the sky, or Emoto kind of in a sense duplicated that in laboratory conditions and could show that the health of the water altered the way it formed a crystal. And so there's some very interesting images in the material that he worked with and showed that water can be affected by outside forces, and it alters the water and it alters the way it crystallizes for the better or the worse. Now, two books that I've mentioned over and over, but I think that you still may want to look into if you have not. I don't know how many times I've had people say, well, this natural stuff that you do, do you is there any scientific research to back it? And I just finally have gotten to the point, I said, well, there is a researcher who has been trained heavily in research, has a PhD. His name is Dr. James Oshman. I've met and talked with him before. And several years ago, he wrote a book called Energy Medicine, The Scientific Basis. I've brought it up several times. If you haven't read it, I would suggest getting it and reading it. In this book, and the second one that he wrote, called Energy Medicine in Therapeutics and Human Performance, goes even further. And in these two books, he went through regular research from universities and various medical researchers and gathered together all the information that shows that there is in fact research on every aspect of natural medicine that has come right out of regular, quote, scientific research and medicine, but no one has bothered to look at it or bring it together. And so he does that in these two books. I understand one of these is in revision, and it may be out in a newer version, but both of these have a tremendous amount of information about a lot of things that I'm talking about. And the foreword to the first one was written by Candace Pert, who received the Nobel Prize for her work on molecules of emotion, and how the body communicates by creating special neuropeptides that carry information throughout the whole body and to every cell in the body, and how she ultimately reached the conclusion that the whole body is the unconscious because all your memories are stored throughout all the cells of the body. And some of the organ research that's been going on in terms of transplants indicate that people who get organs from other people also get memory of people and events from that other person's life. I've heard it poo-pooed, but if you read the evidence, it's too strong. One of the books was written by a lady called A Change of Heart, and tells about it, but there's a lot of other material written on it. And it is true that people who get a tissue from a person also get a piece of their memory along with the tissue, showing that information is held within the cells. And so that's what we're talking about. Part of what, at least what we're talking about, is when we talk about the memory of water, is also that cells do tend to hold information, not just chemicals, but information. And another book that introduces you to a lot of material and I think this is very good, is a researcher by the name of Gerald H. Pollack. He's a university professor, and he's published some books. This one is a good one. It's got a lot of illustrations, a lot of good information. Will probably reshape your thinking about body cells and how they function. And it's called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. Very nice book, and I like books with lots of illustrations, and this book has lots of illustrations. So he can give the ideas across that he's talking about. At the beginning, it may seem like it's totally foreign when you start to read it, but as you get in it, you'll find it interesting. He now has come out with a newer book, and this is what the front of the book looks like, the cover. And it is called The Fourth Phase of Water, Beyond Solid, Liquid, and Vapor. Gerald H. Pollack, P-O-L-L-A-C-K. Very good information. Again, maybe it will revise the way you think about water from that information. Now, I ran across, and this is something you can print out from the internet, a booklet of almost 30 pages called Flow Form Water Research 1970 to 2007, and it's a collection of research and various ideas related to water. It's pretty easy to read. It's got a lot of photos and illustrations in it, and you can get it free off the internet. Flow Form, F-L-O-W, Form Water Research 1970 to 2007. You can print it out. You'll find some interesting material there. Now, I read both sides of all the controversies. I want to see what the people are saying and why they're saying what they're saying. And one of the books I ran into recently was called The Secrets of an Alkaline Body. I think it's been out for a period of time now, a few years maybe at the most. I didn't look at the date in it. But it's 2004 copyright. And it does have some interesting information, but it's called Secrets of an Alkaline Body. Now again, getting back to this alkaline thing, which is why it caught my attention, and there's several out. One book's called Alkalize or Die, and somebody that I know that was treated with cancer, and that's what they were doing. They were being heavily alkalized. It ended up accelerated, and they died very rapidly with it. Getting back to what I said earlier about too much of something is not necessarily good. This book also, it says The New Science of Colloidal Biology, which actually isn't new, but the people who wrote the book, either they were unaware of it or they are claiming it for themselves. I don't know which. But still good information, and gives some justification why they believe what they believe. And it's by a husband and wife, Annie Padden Jubb, J-U-B-B, and David Jubb. And it's interesting information. And as I say, I've probably read dozens of articles and probably at least a dozen books or more written by various authors about alkalinity and alkalizing. The problem is that one of the first questions that I tend to ask somebody when they're talking about alkalizing is, on what basis did you determine that the person needed to be alkalized? And see, that's what the real core of the whole thing is once I've just noticed, I've been in this natural health field pushing 40 plus years, and when an idea gets going, people start jumping on the bandwagon, and most of them on the basis of what someone else has told them, not because they themselves have really gotten into it and researched it thoroughly, but basically because that's what they were told. And they accept it as quote, as they used to say, gospel, and then they run with it. And so, as I say, my very first question always has to do with how are you determining that? How are you determining that the person is too acid, for example? And it's quite interesting, the answers you get. Well, I've heard some say, well, we must be too acid because of our diet and what we eat and the environment and et cetera, et cetera. But that's not, to me, very good evidence. Now, water we're going to get into more, and pH we're going to talk about a lot, and I suppose we ought to talk about what is pH to begin with. Now, pH, the actual definition of pH is that pH is the minus log of the reciprocal of the hydrogen ion concentration. That would be the official definition, but it's not just that, in terms of us understanding it. What happens is that a long time ago, this was established as a criteria for determining acidity or alkalinity, and it's given numbers out of this formula of, and they usually do it by measuring voltage, actually. pH is a measure of voltage as far as the meter, but it's converted to a scale of 1 through 14. 1 being the most acid, 14 the most alkaline, and 7 being the neutral point. So that's what you always hear when you're talking about acid alkaline, is one of those numbers. Well, they say, well, the pH is 5.5. They're extremely acid. Or, that it's 7.8 or whatever. And so those are the numbers that you keep hearing that are based on this hydrogen ion concentration. So the more hydrogen ions there are, then the more acid. Now, the other term for a hydrogen ion is a proton. And a proton is an ion carrying one proton from hydrogen with a positive charge. And The reason it has a positive charge because the one electron is missing from the orbit, leaving it unbalanced and hence having a positive charge. Now, anything that is charged, whether negative or positive, causes it to then be capable of reacting and doing things. If the orbit is full of electrons, the outer orbit, then a substance is inert. That means that it doesn't do much. Like the rare gases, argon and neon and so forth, their outer orbits are full, hence they tend not to form chemical combinations or react. On the other hand, hydrogen, once it's ionized, and hence could use another electron at the very minimum to balance the proton, will react with a lot of other anions, which means something that has a negative charge and is looking for a cation, which is a positive charge, to come together to be balanced. And so hydrogen will combine with chlorine and form hydrochloric acid. It will combine with a sulfate radical and form sulfuric acid. It will react with a nitrogen radical and form nitric acid. So that's where the acidic side of it comes from, and that's what we tend to think about. So at any rate, it's these hydrogen ions that people don't like, and they keep wanting to alkalize, but in order for the body to work properly, it must have protons or hydrogen ions. In fact, there is a movement through the body of hydrogen ions or protons, and the term for that is proticity, the same as the movement of electrons across ions in the body is electricity. Electron, electricity, proton, proticity. Both of those are important to make the body work right. As I said, the body basically is a battery, and it's the movement of these electrons and protons that make things happen, including making energy in the mitochondria. Without both protons and electrons, the mitochondrial activity cannot produce ATP, and hence you cannot build up energy. So you could not have a body with no protons. You would be dead. It would be like having a battery with only one pole, a negative pole. Nothing can happen because there is a movement of electrons toward the protons, and that movement of electrons creates action, and things can happen. And so it's important that you have both of those in the body and in some kind of balance. So now, then we get down that the water, of course, is hydrogen and oxygen. And hydrogen is a proton, so you've got two hydrogen atoms to one oxygen, hence you have H2O, or water. Now, most of this so far is probably relatively easy to understand. Maybe the idea of how we derive at hydrogen, protons, and acidity might be a little more complex, but for someone who's not had any chemistry at all. But anything I'm saying pretty much is at, I would say, high school level if you took chemistry and paid attention, and or high school physics, or both. Anyhow, it's important that they both be there and that they be in some kind of balance. Now, the question is, how do you determine then whether or not the body is acid or alkaline? And that's getting back to what I said earlier. One of the first things that I ask someone then who is advocating we have to alkalize like crazy is, okay, how did you determine that the person was too acidic? Well, usually you find that it has to do with pH of the urine or saliva. Now, for some reason, there's an extrapolation from that says if your urine is acid, then your body is acid, which really has nothing to do with it necessarily. And the reason being, there's a lot more to it than that. And so, in a minute, when I tell you some things about it, you'll begin to think, that really is not a very good idea. unless you understand how it fits in the bigger picture. And there is a much bigger picture, and the picture we want to get to is that the BEV system, bioelectronic Vincent, is based on measuring a series of factors, not just pH, but some other factors in each of the three major body fluids: the urine, saliva, and blood. And so you not only measure the protons, or the acidity, or the pH, but you measure the electrons via a measurement factor called RH2, and also you measure the ions. You know, when you have a battery, you have to have a positive pole, a negative pole, and an electrolyte. An electrolyte in your car battery basically has sulfuric acid as an activator, and therefore electrons can move through it when the hydrochloric acid ionizes in the water, meaning they separate. Then you can move electrons through it, and hence then you have a battery, but you have the positive pole, the negative pole, and the electrolytes. Within our body, we have ions that are conductive ions that conduct electrons, but we also have proton movement too, and interestingly, it's done with structured water, which is water that forms a hexagonal structure. And so the protons then can move through that, and they circle certain protein fiber strands that are like wires, and surrounding those strands are a layer, or probably even multiple layers, of crystalline water, which is the other state. You remember I mentioned Pollock and his fourth state of water. The fourth state is called the crystalline water state. And that is utilized inside cells, and if you read his book on cells and gels, and the newer one on the fourth state of water, you will get some idea of what this is all about and how these form. And they are necessary because without the capability of water forming the crystalline structure of a hexagon, meaning hydrogen and oxygen molecules form a hexagonal shape. They group together to form that hexagonal shape. And when they do that, what they are capable of doing is different. They do things differently. And when you read Osherman's book, he talks about proticity. Remember I said the energy medicine scientific basis and energy medicine in therapeutics and human performance. He actually talks about the movement of the protons, or the proticity, and the crystalline water, or the structured water. And that's the other term that's sometimes used, is called structured water. And there's ways of putting a structure in water. And before we're done, hopefully, not today, because I know we're not going to get to it today, but we'll talk about the structuring of water and why it could be very important. It changes the nature of it. It functions differently than if it's just random molecules or giant clusters. Sometimes molecules of water can cluster in several hundred of the molecules to form giant clusters. But when you look at it, you can't tell the difference. It just looks like clear water. But underneath, the way the molecules are arranged has a lot to do with how it works. And so when we talk about the memory of water, some of this will make maybe some more sense. So, what I'm saying is that the people who are telling you you're too alkaline are measuring your urine or saliva, or too acid, and therefore you have to alkalize, are relying on the pH of one or both of those fluids, more often one or the other. And many that I have read just use the urine alone. And so all they did was they kept throwing things into the body until the urine pH changed, and then they said, okay, we've alkalized the body. And then, of course, they find that it bounces back acidic. And then they think something's wrong. And so then they throw in more alkalizers to try to do it. Now, why is it important that you don't overload with alkalinity and try to get rid of all your protons? Because, number one, you have to have the protons for the body to work. Now, bioelectronic Minnesota takes all that into consideration. But I want to throw something else in, because when you really look at it, the body is compartmentalized in certain ways, and in certain areas, within areas, certain processes take place that require more of one than the other. And the body knows how to make those separations if it has both available. But if you try to get rid of or push out all the protons, you stop a lot of processes in the body. And if you stop those processes, guess what? Some of those involve immune function. And if you turn off the immune system, guess what? The symptoms can disappear, which can be attested to by anyone who's had an organ transplant. Whenever you take a very powerful immunosuppressors, at some point when you have finally deactivated the immune system, guess what? You don't have any symptoms anymore. And I had a person tell me who had had a kidney transplant, well, gee, you know, once this medication took effect, I feel great. I have no symptoms. I can eat anything, I can do anything I want, nothing bothers me. I don't feel anything. But guess what? There is a reason for that, because the body's shut down. It's no longer responding to things that don't belong there, so you can throw anything into it, and you won't be bothered by it. And so the same thing is true by pushing the body to alkaline. The body will try to manage that for a while, but at some point you can deplete it so it can't do it anymore. And when you do, serious things start to happen in the body. And in a moment, I'm going to start talking more about the BEV, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So at any rate, here we have all these people pumping in all this alkalinity. Oh, gee, you know, I feel great. I drink several glasses or a liter or a liter and a half of alkaline water every day, and boy, I feel great. Well, I would say, yeah, that's possible. But the question is, can you trust feelings? Because that is the other side of it. And as I mentioned, Dr. Revisi found that by manipulating pH with certain foods and so forth, he could cause symptoms to disappear. Pain, whatever. But my question is, have you cured the person, or are you only turning off the symptoms? If you do, then you're doing exactly what they're doing with allopathic medicine. They're giving you a drug that turns off your symptoms, and then you feel better. The question is, are you better? And of course to that I say, no, you're not better, you're actually much worse. Okay, so we're ready to talk a little bit about BEV. I want to make sure I get all this covered. Now, as I say, the people who are saying you're too alkaline, too acid, and need more alkalinity, are the people who say they're either monitoring urine or they're monitoring saliva. In a few cases, I've heard some people say they look at both. So, when we talk about BEV, we'll show you why this is a problem. And, of course, they're looking at symptoms. Well, I feel better. And as I say, anything that turns off the immune system is going to make you feel better. Even if it's an antibiotic and it turns off the immune system, you're going to feel better because it shuts down the inflammatory response of redness, heat, swelling, and pain, which is not comfortable. It'll turn that off. And if it turns it off, then you feel better. But as I say, the question is, whatever it was that the body had reacted against, that was trying to get rid of, now it does not do that because it's been stopped in the process. And I could give you, from over the years, thousands of examples of what happens when you do that. Okay, so BEV was developed originally by Dr. Vincent to determine water quality, because that's one of the things you can do. You can measure 3 factors out of water that, when put into an equation, will tell you about the quality of the water. And so that was what he was using, and he was measuring city or commercial water, meaning commercial water supplies, and he was measuring private wells and springs water supplies, and then he was looking at the health over the years when the change went from individual to commercial. And as I said, he saw a tremendous increase in cardiovascular problems and a tremendous increase in cancer when this happened, when they went to the commercial water supplies. So consequently, somewhere along the way, he linked up with Dr. Franz Morel from Germany, and they sat down and they started monitoring people as they came in and correlating that with what they were finding doing other testing. And they began to realize that this system showed promise for monitoring of health or sickness. And what they could do then, they established the parameters of a healthy environment in the body and the parameters of, if it's out of balance, depending on the way it goes out of balance, what kind of problems develop. And after, as I said, at the time I first heard about it from Dr. Morel on one of my German trips at his clinic, he was saying at that point they had done over 1 million tests of people with the process, and that every new patient that came in and every visit they came back, they remeasured and plotted what they were finding otherwise against what they were finding with this system, until they became convinced absolutely that this system had great value in determining the real health of a person and the real biological age of a person. How old are they compared to what they should be? And if they're out of balance, what direction are they going and what types of health problems can they anticipate? And they found it to be very reliable. So much so that the other doctor I talked about, Dr. Reinhold Fohl, when he was getting into this system of measuring people, utilized this system to determine whether they were really getting healthier or whether they just felt better. You know, he realized that the symptom was not always the criteria for determining whether the person was sick or well, because your immune system could be in a heavy inflammatory state, throwing out a lot of stuff from the body, and you feel lousy, but you would actually be getting healthier. And so if you asked the person how they felt, they would think that they weren't doing so well, but in fact, they were doing what they should. Their body was getting rid of things, and they were moving toward a healthier state. So he utilized this system to monitor the people as an outside, objective way of determining where they were. And he found that what he was doing was, in fact, getting people well, and ultimately they were better. And see, the problem with symptoms are, and the problem with disturbances in the body are, that you don't always know immediately. I mean, you can be developing cancer for years and not know it, until finally one day, all of a sudden, out of the blue, well, how did that happen? I wasn't sick. I had a strong immune system. I didn't get colds. I didn't get flus, blah, blah, blah. And now how could I have cancer if I have a strong immune system? Well, the answer is they didn't have a strong immune system. The immune system was shut down. And the reason it was shut down was because something internally was turning it off. Either the body was way out of balance because of diet or toxic exposure, or sometimes factors from vaccinations, over-treatment with medications. A lot of reasons why. Too many pesticides, you name it, too many chemical additives, poor quality food. I mean, it can go on and on. But whatever the reason was, they were getting sick all along, but they didn't know it. And I've seen that in people that had almost no symptoms. I think I mentioned it before, but I remember one lady in particular came from another state, and she had no symptoms except she said, I noticed, she was probably in her late 50s, said, I noticed that I don't have as much energy as I did. I get worn out a little faster, and I don't know if it's just aging or whether there's maybe something isn't quite right. Well, when we tested her, bottom line, she had a massive uterine tumor. When she went in, she decided to have it surgically excised, and when the surgeons opened her up, not only did she have a massive tumor, but her whole body, the lymph, everything, all the organs were filled with cancer, and they said, no sense doing the surgery, it's a waste because she's done. And so they just closed her back up, and within about another 60 days, she was dead. Now here's a lady who didn't have any symptoms. As far as she knew, she was pretty healthy. But this process was going on in the background. And hence, without some way of measuring what's really going on in the body, as opposed to how you feel, could be a problem. And the same thing is true with pushing the body too alkaline. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you why I believe it's very detrimental. And you'll have to go through all the material yourself, and you'll have to reach your own conclusions. But after 40 years plus of clinical practice, I'm convinced that this is the right track. I've seen thousands and thousands of people over the years, and I've seen people come in and recover from terrible problems, and I've seen them go through a lot of misery when their body was reactivated and throwing all the poison out, that they felt terrible, and then I've seen them get well in the long run and be happy because now they really were well. And it wasn't because we were covering up any symptoms. And when I do natural medicine, we don't use herbs like drugs to turn off things. We use herbs in a homeopathic way to enhance the body's system so it can do what it's already trying to do. We're not doing suppressive therapies. We are helping the body regain its ability to correct itself. This system can verify that if you want to utilize the system. Now, I understand that NASA has used a version of this from the German doctors. Actually, they said that they were using a version of it. And some doctors in this country decided to make some apparatus in this country to do the same thing, to do the same set of measurements. And one of the systems was called BTA, Biological Terrain Analysis. They did not want to call it BEV because it was not the original system as developed by Dr. Vincent. And then they later changed it to QFA, which is Quantitative Fluid Analysis. And anyhow, what it is, it's a system of monitoring that can tell you something about the protons, electrons, and ions in the body. And it doesn't do it by just looking at one factor, pH, in one fluid or maybe two fluids, but accurately the whole body. Now, it can be done in abbreviated form, and a lot of times they did that in Germany once they got going. It's known that, generally speaking, the blood parallels the saliva, meaning if the saliva becomes more alkaline, the blood becomes more alkaline. If the saliva becomes less alkaline or more acidic, the blood would tend to become more acidic. But the blood is going to always stay on the slightly alkaline side, and the saliva should stay slightly on the acid side. But as the saliva becomes a little less acid, but still acid, then the blood will tend to become a little more alkaline. And if the saliva becomes more acidic, then the blood would become slightly more acidic, but the blood will always stay on the alkaline side. 1 to 7.2 of the blood is the factor that's used in BEV when you're measuring the blood. And the body maintains that. The blood has buffers, bicarbonate and so forth, and albumin that act as buffers to maintain a certain narrow range within the blood, because if it does go way too alkaline or way too acid, you can be in big trouble. And so it's very critical to the body that it be able to keep that pH very close to 7, just slightly on the alkaline side of 7. And that the other two body fluids are slightly on the acidic side. that's part of the formula that's utilized in BEV. And so when you do the readings, they have what they call the perfect formula, and I'm going to show you a chart that's used to kind of exemplify the whole system. And you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 zones, and those 4 zones have to do with the proton-electron balance. The R factor in the formula has to do with resistance, which has to do with the conductive ions or the electrolyte in the body. And so if you don't have enough electrolyte, you can have a problem. Or if you have too many, it can be a problem. The same as being way too acidic or way too alkaline can be a problem. And so the body homeostasis system maintains a certain balance as much as it can, as long as you don't interfere too much or you don't get overwhelmed with something that blocks the ability of it to do that. Now, when I say that it's very critical to really good health, is that you don't mess it up too badly by going too much one way or the other. Whenever you study physiology and get into the cellular functions, you find out that the blood runs about, let's say, 7.2 on the average of a reasonably healthy person. The interstitial fluids in the matrix, meaning outside the cells, is around 7.2, generally half the day, the matrix. But half the day it's acidic. And I'll talk about that in just a moment, and why. Okay, then inside the cell, the cytoplasm tends to run about 7.2. The fluid part of the cell tends to run about 7.2. However, within that 7.2 pH cytoplasm, there are organelles that carry on certain functions that require a pH down as low as 5.5, which is pretty acid. Now, if you rob all the protons, the body is going to have trouble maintaining that acidity within the alkaline cytoplasm because it doesn't have enough protons. If it has protons, it can move those into those areas that require the acidic pH to function properly, and it can put them out of areas that need to be a little bit more alkaline. And so when you start saying the body is acidic or alkaline, you can't say that. The compartments are what they are, and they do what they do. Now, there's a time when the stomach has to be very acidic, down to a 2 to 3 pH, to break down proteins, because the enzyme in the stomach, pepsin, which job it is to break down large protein molecules into peptide chains, which is why it's called pepsin, that enzyme requires a very acidic environment to work properly. Because remember that the body, all the biochemic actions that take place use enzymes. And guess what? Enzymes are pH sensitive as well as water sensitive and as well as temperature sensitive. So in the stomach, for it to work properly, you should have a 98.6 body temperature, you should have sufficient water available, and you should have sufficient hydrogen ions so that you can have hydrochloric acid, which makes the acid environment for the pepsin enzyme to work properly. Now when you look at it, again getting back to whether the person's too acidic, in your mouth, normally the saliva would run somewhere around 6.4 to 6.6, possibly. Okay? If a person is healthy, and the other factors are where they should be. Okay, so that's what the saliva is running. However, you put a piece of potato in your mouth and start chewing on it, which is a carbohydrate, and guess what? The saliva is triggered to produce an enzyme, or release it into the mouth, into the saliva, which starts the first stage of carbohydrate digestion. Now, that then, for that enzyme to work properly, requires an alkaline environment. So guess what? The saliva will suddenly withhold all of the protons, and you'll see the pH go up to 7, 8, somewhere in that range, while this process is going on in the mouth. Once you swallow that piece of potato, and in a little while, the pH will go back down to 6.5, 4, 5, 6, in that range, in a healthy person. Because that enzyme required alkalinity to work properly, but the stomach acid is required to make the pepsin work properly. So the first stage of carbohydrate takes place in the mouth in an alkaline environment. The first stage of protein breakdown takes place in the stomach, which requires an acid environment. But the hydrochloric acid is not only necessary for the stomach function, it also is very important for liver function, because the liver requires acidic or hydrogen ions for it to work properly. And in Chinese medicine, it's said that the flavor of liver is sour, which is acid. And so you have to have that acid. So what happens if you flood your stomach with a bunch of alkalinity? Well, you know, it can have certain effects, but those effects are not, in my mind, health-producing effects. Okay, so now, when the material moves out of the stomach into the small intestine, another set of enzymes come into play, which are proteases, amylases, and lipases. But guess what? Those enzymes require an alkaline environment again. So guess what? The pancreas empties bicarbonate into the small intestine to make it more alkaline for those enzymes to work properly, to finish breaking down fats, the peptides of the protein into amino acids, and the sugar molecules that were partially broken down in the mouth the rest of the way to release the sugar. Now, interesting. So, what happens if everything is alkaline? Some things might work, some things may not. But if you don't break down in the stomach the proper amount of the protein, then it can't be further broken down in the small intestine, because the enzymes in the small intestine are not made to break down protein molecules as a whole. They're made to break down peptides that have been already broken down in the stomach. And then when you shift from the small intestine into the colon, the environment shifts more acidic again for the final processes to take place in the colon. Now, when you look at all this, then how can you say that you just have to keep alkalizing and alkalizing and alkalizing? You are going to stress the body. And when you do the BEV test, it proves this. Now, each of these zones that we showed you earlier have to do with proton, hydrogen ions, and electrons. Okay, so each of the four. So I don't even have time to get into all the implications of the formula or the whole process that this could tell you. But I will say that if you're in one of these different zones, it has to do with the amount of protons and electrons. Generally speaking, these two zones have more protons, meaning they're more acidic. These two zones have more alkalinity because they're missing protons. Okay? These two have more electrons. These have less electrons. Okay, so it's the combination of protons and electrons become extremely important, apart from the conductive ions, which is the R factor. Okay, now, if you're up in this range, you're going to be subject to certain types of problems. The body will. If you're in this one, which unfortunately most people in modern society, in our society, have moved more into this third zone, and guess what that third zone represents? It represents alkaline and oxidized. Alkaline and oxidized. Now, what does that mean? Low protons, low electrons. Now, if you're over-alkalizing, what are you doing? You're moving the body more in this direction. Most people, when you do this whole test today, fall into this category. A few do in the second zone. More do in the third zone. This area, this lighter area, the pink area on here, is called the precancerous zone. Pre-Krebs in German, which Krebs means cancer. This is the precancer zone. If you continue to go outward, because it's kind of like they go out on a tangent, if you continue to go out, this is, the second zone is the cancer. Doesn't mean you not necessarily have it today, but you're now in a state that cancer could form. If you go out here, this is cancer irreversible. You are so far out of balance, so missing protons and electrons, that you likely can't turn it around. And when that happens, you start to move down to the fourth zone, and it's in this fourth zone that we have things like death. Now, I've watched this with patients when we've done these tests, and when I've seen them be over in here, more often than not, they may have cancer already. I've had them here, and when they were here, they definitely had cancer. They came in with cancer, and some, there's a triangle that forms. This is the healthy triangle right here. And I've had this big triangle would form up here and down here to the death thing. And I can remember that those people came in, they already had metastatic cancer. And when I saw that, the German doctors who do the test, Dr. Morel said, when they're over here, send them back to regular medicine, send them to the hospital, because they're not probably not going to recover. And I found that is accurate. Now, this is a good system, but what does it tell you? It's not that simple. Now, here are the parameters that they're talking about. The blood should be 7-1, ideal. The saliva should be 6-5, ideal. And they feel that the urine should be 6-8. That's probably pretty accurate. If the others are what they're supposed to be, that probably would be good. And there's a reason for that, and I'm not going to get into it at this point. We're already over time. The other numbers have to do with electrons, 22 blood, 22 saliva, and 24 urine. The higher the number, the less electrons. And so 22 to 24 is pretty good. But there should be more electrons in the blood and saliva than in the urine. Okay, then the R factor has to do with the resistance factor, and they won't mean anything to you, but it's 210 on the blood, 140 on the saliva, and 30 on the urine. And the reason it should be so low in the urine because you're throwing a lot of debris out from normal metabolism, and that lowers the R factor, which means that it's more conductive, and therefore the number goes low. So anyhow, that's the idea how this works. Now, interestingly, what they have found that as the blood and saliva become more alkaline, the urine tends to become more acidic. They separate. And the sicker you get here, the more the separation. So if you're alkalizing and you study the urine and it's down to 5.5, you're saying, oh, they're way too acid, we got to alkalize even more. What does that do to this third zone? Now also the cardiovascular issues show up in this zone also, and that's the two biggies that we mentioned earlier that are the two big killers, number 1 and 2 in this country, and I suppose in most of the developed countries. So anyhow, we've expanded our time way over, and we didn't get too much into the water yet, which we need to get into more, but at least this will get you thinking, especially when someone says you should buy one of these $4,000 units, it's going to alkalize your water. You might want to think twice before you spend that $4,000. You might want to put it in a slush fund to pay for the illnesses that start popping up when you're shifting your body way over into the alkaline zone 3 of the Vincent method or the BEV method, because that's where it's going to push your body. And as I say, it's very deceptive. And if you're trying to push your saliva up to 7 and you're trying to push your urine up to 7 and think you're doing something good, I personally, from my clinical experience, say not so. Now there's another system that in some ways are like this, called the Reams biological ionization theory, or theory of ionization, RBTI. And that he said that he feels that the urine and saliva pHs should be about 6.4, 6.5 to be really good. But they're very close. But they do the same thing. They put both the saliva and the urine on the acidic side of the 7. And so, I hope I've given you enough to provoke you a little bit and to get you started looking. We still have a lot to do with water and the memory of water and how it kind of ties in with all this. But I at least hope I've given you enough to get started and maybe get you thinking maybe in a different path. Our time is up, and in fact it's way over. We'll wrap this up in the next session. And after you've thought about it a little bit, then I'll maybe be able to, it will answer what I bring up, some of the questions you might have. But just be aware that the saliva and or urine is not going to tell you the whole body condition if you don't look at it in relation to other factors. So it was nice being with you again, and also in the meantime, until the next broadcast, be healthy.